Readers are welcome to leave comments in the comments section.
The downpour over Grand Street was the unrelenting kind that turned Williamsburg asphalt into a slick black mirror. Inside the Iron Kettle, a half-lit hybrid of a late-night espresso bar and vintage tavern, the air smelled of damp wool, roasted Arabica, and cedar wood. Maya Vance tapped her drafting pencil against the zinc counter. 3 crisp beats. Pause. 3 crisp beats. Spread out across the dark oak surface were 6 sheets of translucent vellum paper, covered in precise graphite lines, dimensions, and structural notes. The pitch was tomorrow at 8 in the morning. The client, a high-profile real estate developer restoring a raw, timber-framed brick warehouse near the South 5th Street Pier. The stakes, her independent studio's survival for the next 2 years. Maya dragged a hand through her dark waves, sighing softly as she reached for her double-shot espresso. Her fingers closed around thin air. Where her steaming ceramic cup should have sat, there was only a wet ring on the wood. 2 feet away, a hand lifted the warm cup toward a pair of dark, composed lips. "Hey," Maya said, her voice cutting clean through the low hum of the rain and the vinyl jazz record playing in the corner. "That's mine." The woman holding the cup didn't flinch. She took a slow, deliberate sip before setting the ceramic down with a quiet, solid clink. She turned her head slightly, letting the low amber lamplight catch the sharp angle of her jawline. She wore a dark, tailored coat damp with raindrops, her collar popped, and her dark hair fell past her collarbone in effortless, wet waves. "Your name isn't on it," the woman replied. Her tone was low, smooth, and laced with a quiet, infuriating amusement. "It's a double ristretto with oat milk and a dash of cinnamon," Maya said, stepping closer. She leaned one elbow onto the bar, shortening the distance between them until she could catch the subtle scent of rain, bergamot, and roasted espresso off the stranger's coat. "The barista called it out 2 minutes ago. You walked in, took off your scarf, and commandeered my caffeine." The stranger's eyes were a cool, striking hazel under the dim Edison bulbs. She looked down at Maya's cup, then back up into Maya's eyes, her gaze lingering on Maya's mouth for a fraction of a second too long. "A double ristretto," the woman repeated softly. A slow, faint smile touched the corner of her lips. "Bold choice for 10:30 on a Thursday night. You're either running from a deadline or running from a mistake." "Neither," Maya said, holding her ground, refusing to glance away. "I'm finishing a masterpiece. Or I was, until you hijacked my fuel." "A masterpiece?" The stranger tilted her head. Without asking, she took a half-step sideways, leaning over the zinc counter to glance down at the vellum sheets Maya had spread out. Maya moved instinctively to block her view, stepping into the woman's space. Their shoulders brushed, a light, sudden contact through layers of denim and wool that sent a sharp spike of static through the air between them. Neither of them pulled back. "Private work," Maya murmured, her eyes locking onto the stranger's. "Private, but flawed," the woman whispered back, her breath cool against the warm ambient air of the bar. She didn't look down at the paper anymore, her eyes stayed locked on Maya's face, challenging her, reading her. "Your natural light calculations for the southern facade. You're assuming 4 hours of direct afternoon sun." Maya froze. Her breath caught in her throat. "What?" The woman reached out. Her fingers were long, manicured, and cold from the rain outside. She picked up Maya's graphite pencil off the wood, her knuckles brushing against Maya's forearm as she did. The touch was light, but the warmth lingered like a burn. With quick, practiced strokes, the stranger drew a single, fluid line across the corner of Maya's floor plan on the vellum paper. The adjacent building on Kent Avenue threw up a 5-story steel frame last month, the woman said softly, her voice hovering inches from Maya's ear as she leaned over the bar. At 2 in the afternoon, your south facade sits completely in shadow. If you rely on exposed timber beams without recessed indirect lead fixtures along that primary axis, your grand open plan loft is going to look like a cellar. Maya stared at the mark on the paper. Her mind raced, verifying the geometry in seconds. The stranger was right. It was a blind spot, a dangerous, stupid oversight that would have cost Maya the entire contract during tomorrow's presentation. Maya slowly looked up from the drawing. The stranger was standing close enough that Maya could see the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes, the faint dampness on her skin from the storm, and the calm, mocking composure in her posture. "Who are you?" Maya asked, her voice dropping into a rough whisper. The woman set the pencil back down on the counter, right beside Maya's hand. She reached for the espresso cup once more, taking one final sip before sliding it across the wood back to Maya. "Consider it payment for the coffee," the woman said softly. She reached down, picked up a sleek leather messenger bag off the stool beside her, and slung it over her shoulder. "You didn't answer my question," Maya said, grabbing the edge of the bar to stop herself from reaching out to grab the woman's coat. The stranger paused at the doorway, turning back just enough to look over her shoulder. The rain outside framed her silhouette against the streetlights. "I'm someone who doesn't like seeing good space wasted," she said. Her eyes held Maya's for 3 agonizing, electric seconds. "Get some sleep, architect. You look like you need it." Before Maya could respond, the heavy glass door pushed open, letting in a gust of cold autumn air and the roar of traffic on Grand Street. The door clicked shut. The stranger was gone. Maya stood alone at the bar, her heart hammering against her ribs. She picked up the espresso cup, the porcelain was still warm where the stranger's hands had held it, and looked down at the precise, perfect graphite line drawn on her blueprint. The next morning, Brooklyn was washed in crisp, pale sunlight. By 7:45 a.m., Maya was standing outside the massive iron gates of the historic brick warehouse on South 5th Street. The air smelled of salt from the East River just a block away. Her dark circles were hidden under a layer of concealer, her navy blazer was pressed, and her leather portfolio case felt heavy and full of answers. She had stayed up until 2 in the morning completely reworking the lighting grid based on the stranger's sharp critique. She pushed open the heavy wooden door of the building, stepping onto the concrete floor of the ground level. The space was magnificent, soaring double-height ceilings, exposed red brick, steel trusses, and grand arched windows overlooking the water. Sunlight cut across the dust motes in long, golden shafts. "Maya? Glad you made it early," a voice called out. Marcus, the lead developer from the investment firm, walked out from behind a line of scaffolding. He was a tall man in his 50s with graying temples and an expensive tailored suit, holding a silver iPad under his arm. "Morning, Marcus," Maya said, taking a firm step forward and shaking his hand. "The space is incredible in the morning light." "It really is," Marcus agreed, turning around. "And we're almost ready to dive into your pitch. But before we review your floor plans, I want to introduce you to the team's latest addition. We brought her on late yesterday afternoon to oversee the entire architectural lighting and preservation scope." Maya's pulse gave a sudden, uneasy thump. "Lighting scope?" "Yes," Marcus smiled, turning toward the far end of the loft where a figure stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the East River. "She's the best in the city." Just moved back from London last month. Marcus raised his voice slightly. Clara, come meet our lead interior architect. The figure by the window turned. Maya's breath caught instantly in her chest. She wore a crisp cream silk shirt tucked into high-waisted dark trousers today, but the posture was unmistakable. The effortless grace, the dark, shoulder-length waves, and those piercing hazel eyes. Clara held a white paper coffee cup in one hand. As she walked toward them across the concrete floor, her heels clicking softly against the ground, her eyes locked directly onto Maya. A familiar, dangerous spark flared in her eyes. Maya Vance, meet Clara Mercer, Marcus said, completely oblivious to the sudden, suffocating wall of tension that slammed into the room. Clara will have final veto power over all light and spatial integration for the project. Clara stopped 2 steps in front of Maya. The distance between them was formal, professional, but the atmosphere immediately felt as tight and oxygen-deprived as the cramped corner of the bar the night before. Clara extended her right hand. On her wrist sat a slim, minimalist silver watch. Her fingers were long, cool, and precise, the same fingers that had traced lines across Maya's blueprints 10 hours ago. A pleasure to meet you, Miss Vance, Clara said, her voice smooth, low, and completely composed. Maya stared at the outstretched hand for a long beat before slowly extending her own. When their palms met, Clara's fingers wrapped around Maya's with a firm, deliberate squeeze. Clara didn't pull away immediately. Instead, she leaned in half an inch, just enough for Maya to catch that subtle hint of rain and bergamot once again. I trust you slept well, Clara whispered, her voice too quiet for Marcus to hear, her hazel eyes gleaming with silent triumph. Maya felt her face flush, her grip tightening around Clara's hand as her pride ignited into a blaze of pure, competitive adrenaline. I slept terribly, Miss Mercer, Maya replied, matching Clara's low tone, her voice steady and laced with sharp confidence. I was up all night fixing someone else's mess. Clara's lips twitched upward into a slow, breathtaking smile. She released Maya's hand, stepping back into the open space, her eyes never leaving Maya's face. Good, Clara said softly, gesturing toward the drafting table set up in the middle of the room. Then let's see if your work lives up to your attitude. The plywood work table in the center of the raw warehouse was cold to the touch, covered in a thin sheet of fine brick dust. Maya unrolled her modified vellum sheets, pressing the corners down with a heavy steel tape measure and 2 iron brackets she pulled from her leather bag. Marcus hovered at her right, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, while Clara stood directly across from Maya. Clara's coat was draped neatly over a wooden sawhorse nearby. In her sleeveless charcoal silk knit top, her shoulders were sharp, defined, and completely still. When we look at the south elevation, Maya began, her voice striking a steady, resonant rhythm against the vast brick walls, we have to acknowledge the 5-story reality on Kent Avenue. Direct sunlight drops off precipitously after 1:45 p.m. during the winter solstice. Maya didn't look at Clara as she spoke, but she felt Clara's hazel eyes tracking every gesture of her hand over the graphite lines. Instead of forcing passive solar gain that simply won't exist, Maya continued, tapping the newly drawn recess channels along the structural timber. We embed a dual-phase indirect ledger system into the original longleaf yellow pine beams. The housing is completely concealed within a 1/4-inch brass channel flush with the wood. It bounces warm light upward against the exposed barrel-vaulted ceiling, creating a soft, ambient glow that mimics late afternoon sun, regardless of what construction happens next door. Marcus leaned down, whistling softly. Clean. Invisible fixture placement, maximum visual height. What do you think, Clara? Clara didn't answer immediately. She walked around the perimeter of the work table, her leather pumps making rhythmic, hollow clicks against the concrete slab. She stopped right beside Maya, close enough that the edge of her silk top almost brushed Maya's blazer sleeve. Clara reached out, her index finger resting right beside Maya's freshly drawn brass channel detail. Her nail was polished a subtle, dark plum. The quarter-inch channel is aesthetically refined, Vance, Clara murmured, her tone smooth, cool, and critical. But pine from 1890 expands and contracts with the East River's humidity swings. Have you calculated the thermal tolerance between the brass housing and the 130-year-old timber? Maya turned her head slowly to look at Clara. The spatial distance between them was less than 10 inches. Maya could see the precise golden ring around Clara's pupils, the quiet calculation in her gaze, and the faint, teasing lift at the corner of her lips. The brass tracks are mounted on floating silicone gaskets, Maya said, her voice dropping a register, steady and unyielding. Zero metal-to-wood tension. Full allowance for ambient humidity expansion up to 12%. I ran the thermal differential numbers at 2 in the morning. Clara's gaze didn't drift to the paper. It stayed locked on Maya's eyes. 2 in the morning, Clara repeated softly, so low that Marcus, who was busy examining the elevation cross-section, missed it entirely. You're thorough when you're cornered. I'm thorough when I'm right, Maya countered quietly. A heavy silence stretched between them, thick with an invisible, pulling force. Clara's eyes flicked down to Maya's mouth for a fraction of a second, then back up. She straightened her spine, turning back to Marcus with effortless poise. The structural solution is sound, Marcus, Clara said smoothly, her professional mask slipping back into place like silk over steel. In fact, it's exceptional. It saves us 3 weeks of structural retrofitting on the main facade. Marcus slapped his hand against his knee. Outstanding. That's what I like to hear. If the two of you are already in lockstep on the spatial lighting integration, I can leave you to finalize the millwork details while I head to Midtown for the board update. We're managing just fine, Clara said, her eyes sliding back toward Maya with a dark, glinting promise. Aren't we, Maya? Hearing her first name fall from Clara's lips in that low, cultured accent sent a quiet shiver straight down Maya's spine. She forced her expression to remain cool and collected. We're just getting started, Marcus. Once the heavy entrance door slammed shut behind Marcus, leaving the two of them alone in the 4,000-square-foot brick cavern, the silence returned with sudden weight. The distant rumble of traffic from the Williamsburg Bridge hummed through the glass panes high above. Maya began rolling up her auxiliary sketch papers, her hands quick and methodical. You knew, Maya said without looking up, her voice echoing off the brick. Knew what? Clara asked, stepping toward the sawhorse to retrieve her dark coat. You knew you were assigned to this project when you walked into the iron kettle last night, Maya said, snapping a rubber band around a paper tube. She turned to face Clara, resting her hip against the edge of the work table. You didn't just stumble into my coffee. You knew who I was, you saw my blueprints, and you let me sit there thinking you were just a rude stranger with a taste for overpriced espresso. Clara draped her coat over her arm and walked slowly toward Maya. Her steps were unhurried, magnetic. She stopped directly in front of Maya, trapping her between her own lingering posture and the heavy wooden table behind her. I didn't know your name until I saw your signature in the bottom right title block of that vellum sheet, Clara admitted softly, leaning in until her perfume, sandalwood, rain, and cold bergamot, surrounded Maya entirely. And as for the coffee, I was curious. Marcus spoke highly of his independent architect. I wanted to see if you had real vision, or if you were just another designer painting pretty lines on old brick. And what did you decide? Maya asked, refusing to lean back, her chin lifted in quiet defiance. Clara reached out. Her slender fingers hesitated for a microsecond before gently tucking a stray lock of dark hair behind Maya's ear. Her fingertips lightly grazed the soft skin of Maya's jaw, leaving a trail of warmth that made Maya's breath hitch in her throat. I decided, Clara whispered, her thumb lingering near the corner of Maya's lower lip, that you're remarkably stubborn. And surprisingly sharp when challenged. Maya's pulse hammered wildly against her ribs. She reached up, catching Clara's wrist in her hand. Clara's pulse under Maya's fingertips was fast, not as calm as her smooth voice implied. Don't play games with my project, Clara, Maya warned softly, her thumb pressing lightly against Clara's inner wrist. Clara looked down at where Maya's hand held her wrist, then back up into Maya's eyes, a genuine, intoxicating laugh bubbling in her chest. Is that what you think this is? A game? Isn't it? If it were a game, Vance, I would have let you present those flawed daylight calculations to Marcus this morning and watched you flounder, Clara said, her tone dropping into something intimate, rich, and unfiltered. She didn't pull her wrist away. Instead, she stepped half an inch closer, her chest almost flush with Maya's. I helped you fix it because I want this building to be extraordinary. And because I wanted to see what you look like when you're pushed. Maya held her ground, her heart racing as she slowly released Clara's wrist. Her skin felt electric where they had touched. I don't break under pressure. I know, Clara murmured, her hazel eyes gleaming with an intense, unyielding light. That's what makes this so dangerous. Clara took a step back, breaking the suffocating physical magnetic field between them, though her gaze remained tethered to Maya's face. She checked the slim silver watch on her wrist. I have a site review with the steel fabricators in Greenpoint, Clara said, smoothing down the front of her dark trousers. But our work today isn't finished. The ambient light along the river changes drastically as the sun drops behind the Manhattan skyline. Maya cleared her throat, trying to steady her erratic breathing. I have the solar path charts for dusk. Charts are dead paper, Clara said, picking up her messenger bag. She turned at the doorway, her silhouette cut against the bright morning light pouring through the riverfront windows. Meet me at 7 o'clock. The rooftop at Harriet's, in Dumbo. We'll watch the light fade over the water and figure out if your brass channels can hold up under real darkness. Is that an official project meeting, Miss Mercer? Maya called out, her voice laced with sharp, playful friction. Clara paused, looking back over her shoulder with a slow, devastating curve of her lips. Call it whatever helps you sleep tonight, architect, Clara said quietly. Don't be late. She stepped out, the iron door clicking shut behind her, leaving Maya alone in the sunlit dust of the warehouse, her hands still trembling slightly against the edge of the drafting table. The sky over the East River was bruised purple and molten gold when Maya stepped out of the elevator onto the rooftop of Harriet's in Dumbo. The air up here was crisp, carrying the brackish scent of the tide mixing with the warm aroma of cedar wood smoke drifting up from Furman Street below. The panoramic view was staggering. The historic Brooklyn Bridge stretched out like an intricate web of illuminated steel, while the lower Manhattan skyline burned soft, radiant amber against the deep twilight. Maya adjusted the dark leather strap of her shoulder bag. She had swapped her daytime structured blazer for a dark forest green fitted sweater tucked into high-waisted tailored trousers, her wool coat draped loosely over one arm. Clara was already seated at a low corner booth against the glass perimeter, a dark slate table separating her from the sheer drop toward the river below. She wore an ivory cashmere coat draped casually over her shoulders like a cape, revealing a delicate black silk camisole underneath. Her collarbone caught the fading golden light of the dusk. In front of her sat a heavy crystal glass filled with dark amber liquid and a single oversized sphere of clear, carved ice. As Maya approached, Clara didn't turn around immediately, but her posture shifted, a subtle, deliberate release of tension in her spine that told Maya she had been noticed long before her heels clicked against the dark hardwood decking. "You're precisely 4 minutes late, Vance," Clara said without turning her head, her voice carrying easily over the soft ambient house music playing from the rooftop speakers. "Traffic on the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway doesn't care about architectural precision," Maya said, stepping around the corner of the booth and taking the seat directly across from her. A waiter appeared within seconds. Maya ordered a rye Manhattan with a twist. Clara raised an eyebrow, a faint, amused line creasing the corner of her lips as she gently swirled her glass. "Rye," Clara noted softly, cradling her drink between 2 long, pale fingers. A predictable choice for an architect with a distinct taste for structural density. "And yours?" Maya asked, resting her forearms on the cool slate table, leaning slightly forward into Clara's space. "Neat mezcal. Smoked oak and raw earth." Clara took a slow, deliberate sip, her hazel eyes watching Maya over the rim of the crystal glass. "I prefer things that don't try to hide what they are." "Is that why you moved back from London?" Maya countered, her voice low, steady, and sharp. "Because you missed unfiltered truths." Clara looked at her for a long, quiet moment. The setting sun caught the precise edge of her pupils, turning them into pools of polished amber. "I moved back because London became predictable," Clara said, setting her glass down with a quiet, solid tap against the stone. "Everyone agreed with my lighting layouts before I even finished drafting them." "Total agreement is tedious, Maya. It breeds lazy work." "So you came back to New York looking for someone to argue with you?" "I came back looking for someone who could hold their own," Clara murmured, her tone dropping into that rich, velvet register that seemed to erase the chatter of the surrounding rooftop crowd. "Someone who wouldn't collapse the moment I questioned their vision." The server delivered Maya's Manhattan. Maya took a small sip, feeling the rye warm her throat as the chill of the evening wind settled over the rooftop. Outside the glass perimeter, the floodlights along the Brooklyn Bridge flickered on, one by one, tracing brilliant lines of yellow light across the dark water. "Look at the trick of light reflection off the Financial District towers," Clara said, shifting her weight toward the glass railing. She didn't look back at Maya. Instead, she reached across the small table, her slender fingers tapping lightly against the wooden armrest of Maya's chair. "Notice how the tinted glass on the lower 3 floors absorbs the twilight blue, while the structural crown holds the warm spectrum." Maya didn't look at the towers across the river. She looked at Clara's profile, the sharp, elegant line of her jaw, the quiet focus in her gaze, and the dark wave of hair catching the wind off the bay. "I see it," Maya whispered. Clara turned her head then, her face only inches from Maya's. The spatial proximity was sudden, startling, and completely intentional. The cool autumn wind whipped between them, but the heat radiating from Clara's skin was impossible to ignore. "You aren't looking at the building, Vance," Clara said, her eyes searching Maya's face with quiet, ruthless accuracy. "I'm observing the primary light source," Maya replied, refusing to back away an inch, her pulse hammering hard against her ribs. "Isn't that what you brought me up here for?" Clara's gaze lingered on Maya's lips for 2 long beats before sliding back up to her eyes. Slowly, deliberately, Clara reached out across the narrow wooden divider. Her fingertips brushed against the soft cuff of Maya's sweater. She didn't pull back. Her touch moved upward, her knuckles lightly tracing the sensitive skin of Maya's inner wrist, right over the racing beat of her pulse. "Your pulse is elevated," Clara observed softly, a subtle, tantalizing smile curving her mouth. "Is it the rooftop altitude, or the mezcal?" "It's the company," Maya said, her voice dropping into a rough, unfiltered honest pitch. She turned her hand over, her palm meeting Clara's, her fingers closing gently around Clara's long, cool fingers. "You're a distraction, Clara. And you know exactly what you're doing." Clara didn't pull her hand away. Instead, her thumb rubbed a slow, lingering circle against the back of Maya's knuckles. "If I were trying to distract you, Maya," Clara whispered, leaning in until her warm breath brushed the shell of Maya's ear, "we wouldn't be talking about architecture." A quiet, magnetic static held them in place as the city lights fully ignited around them. The casual physical touch on the table lingered through the rest of their drinks, subtle brushes of knees beneath the narrow slate surface, deliberate eye contact that stretched long past professional boundaries, and shared silences that felt heavier and far more dangerous than anything they said aloud. When Clara finally called for the bill, she stood up and drew her ivory coat around her shoulders with effortless elegance. "Walk with me," Clara said, not as a command, but as a quiet invitation as she adjusted her leather shoulder strap. "Where?" Maya asked, standing up and slipping her own wool coat on. "Down to the shoreline. I want to show you something about how the bridge anchors the park before the midnight tide turns." They took the glass elevator down to street level, stepping out into the chilly night air on Furman Street. The old cobblestones of Dumbo glistened under the warm yellow glow of streetlights. They walked side by side toward Pebble Beach at the edge of Brooklyn Bridge Park. The sound of the East River lapping against the rounded stones grew louder, mixing with the rhythmic, heavy thrum of traffic crossing high above on the bridge deck. They stopped near the water's edge. The Manhattan skyline across the dark expanse was fully illuminated now, casting long, shimmering ribbons of gold, silver, and blue across the moving water. Clara stood close, so close that her shoulder rested lightly against Maya's arm, shielding them both from the biting breeze coming off the bay. "Tomorrow at 9, we present the revised electrical schedule to the Landmark Preservation Board," Clara said quietly, her eyes fixed on the glittering reflections in the water. "I know," Maya said, turning her head to look down at her profile. "Are we ready?" Clara turned to face her, her silhouette framed by the glowing expanse of the bridge behind her. She stepped closer, closing the last remaining inches between them until her chest was almost touching Maya's. The river wind caught Clara's hair, blowing a dark strand across Maya's cheek. Clara reached up, her hand resting gently on the lapel of Maya's coat. Her long fingers curled into the thick wool fabric, holding Maya in place with minimal physical force, but absolute authority. "The blueprints are ready," Clara whispered, her hazel eyes dark and deep in the moonlight, gleaming with a quiet, dangerous challenge. "The real question, Maya, is whether you're ready for what happens after we win." Maya felt her breath catch in her throat. She didn't step back. Instead, her hand rose instinctively, her fingers resting against the small of Clara's waist, feeling the warmth of her body through the cashmere layer. "Try me, Miss Mercer," Maya whispered back, her voice laced with quiet fire. Clara's smile was small, slow, and utterly breathtaking against the backdrop of the illuminated city. The high-ceilinged public hearing room on the 9th floor of 1 Center Street smelled of old floor wax, damp umbrellas, and lukewarm municipal coffee. Behind the curved oak dais sat 5 members of the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, their expressions impassive under the harsh fluorescent fixtures of the David N. Dinkins Municipal Building. Maya adjusted the crisp collar of her white silk shirt beneath her fitted charcoal blazer. Spread across the presenter's oak podium were 6 revised architectural boards detailing the structural and lighting design for the Domino Sugar Warehouse project. Beside her, Clara stood completely poised, her long arms crossed lightly over a tailored navy wool trench coat, her dark eyes reflecting the cool, unblinking authority of someone who had navigated these bureaucratic government chambers a dozen times before. The Commission has thoroughly reviewed your proposed structural penetrations along the south facade, Miss Vance, Commissioner Hayes said, his grey eyebrows knitting together tightly as he peered over his half-moon spectacles. We remain deep in reservation regarding the installation of modern aluminum and brass conduit tracks into original 1890 longleaf yellow pine timber. This body does not grant variances for mere aesthetic convenience. Maya stepped directly up to the brass microphone, her palms resting flat against the polished wood of the podium. It isn't aesthetic convenience, Commissioner Hayes. It's structural preservation achieved through active environmental regulation. The brass recessed channels, Clara added smoothly, taking a half step forward so her shoulder brushed lightly against Maya's in a silent, unwavering show of absolute unity, are manufactured strictly to floating tolerances. They require zero mechanical anchoring into the primary load-bearing grain. In fact, by routing our indirect lead channels through the existing microfissures created by a century of natural timber movement, we actually seal and stabilize the beam surfaces against future East River moisture intrusion. Commissioner Hayes leaned forward over his papers, looking intently from Maya to Clara. And your thermal dissipation math holds up under full electrical load. We calculated a maximum heat variance of less than 0.3 degrees Celsius against the pine surface, Maya said, her voice steady, crisp, and completely devoid of hesitation. She slid a fresh technical breakdown chart across the registrar's desk. The silicone thermal barrier isolates the track entirely from the timber frame. You get 0 grain scorching, 0 structural degradation, and a 92% reduction in surface-mounted visual hardware. A quiet rustle of heavy paper echoed through the solemn room as the commissioners exchanged low, brief whispers among themselves. Clara turned her head slightly toward Maya. Her hazel eyes held a faint, dangerous spark of triumph, a silent, private language passing between them in front of a gallery full of city officials, unrivaled developers. Commissioner Hayes brought his wooden gavel down against the bench with a sharp, decisive crack. Application approved as submitted. Next item on the morning docket. The breath Maya had been holding left her lungs in a long, quiet rush. She immediately began gathering her technical boards, her fingers trembling ever so slightly from the sudden release of intense adrenaline. Told you, Clara whispered, her voice low, velvety, and intoxicatingly close as she bent down to help slide a mounted foam board into Maya's leather portfolio case. Her warm breath brushed the sensitive shell of Maya's ear, quick and intimate. They never knew what hit them. We were good, Maya murmured, looking up to meet Clara's gaze. The physical distance between their faces was barely 5 inches across the crowded podium. We were seamless, Clara corrected softly, her long fingers lingering over Maya's where they rested on the leather handles of the case. Now let's get out of here before Hayes finds a reason to change his mind. When they pushed open the massive brass and glass doors of 1 Center Street onto the street level, Manhattan had surrendered to a sudden, violent autumn deluge. Water poured off the granite arches of the municipal building, turning City Hall Park into a blurred canvas of thrashing green leaves, cascading puddles, and speeding yellow taxis. My car is parked 3 blocks south on Nassau Street, Clara said, pulling the thick collar of her coat up against the driving wind. We'll be soaked through to the skin in 30 seconds, Maya said, shielding her heavy portfolio case beneath her arm. Clara reached out and grabbed Maya's wrist, her grip firm, warm, and possessively sudden, pulling her beneath the sheltered overhang of the subway entrance. My apartment is in Brooklyn Heights. 5 minutes across the Manhattan Bridge by cab if we catch one right now. Maya looked down at Clara's long fingers wrapped securely around her wrist, then up into those striking hazel eyes, bright and clear against the storm's dark grey shadow. Is that an official invitation, Miss Mercer? It's Spatial Emergency Management, Vance, Clara replied, her dark lips curving into a slow, devastating smile that made Maya's pulse race. Unless you want your expensive vellum drawings turned into papier-mâché by sewage rain. 10 minutes later, they were escaping the howling wind through the heavy mahogany front door of a historic 4-story brownstone on Pierpont Street. The townhome was quiet and warm, smelling of dry cedar wood, old paper, and rich black tea. Warm amber light spilled from recessed perimeter fixtures onto wide plank walnut floors and tall, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves overflowing with architectural volumes. Clara unbuttoned her damp wool coat, slipping it off her shoulders with fluid grace and hanging it on a brass hook near the entry foyer. Underneath, she wore a simple sleeveless charcoal silk top that clung to her sharp, elegant frame. Raindrops glistened like tiny diamonds on the dark waves of her hair and along the exposed curve of her collarbone. "Give me your coat," Clara said softly, stepping closer into the entryway. Maya unbuttoned her damp blazer, handing it over. As Clara took the heavy wool fabric, her fingers brushed deliberately across the base of Maya's neck, her touch leaving a trailing wake of heat that made Maya's breath catch in her throat. "I'll fetch a towel," Clara murmured, her gaze lingering on Maya's mouth for a beat too long before she turned down the hallway. Maya walked deeper into the high-ceilinged living room. A large vintage drafting table sat near the front bay windows, covered in trace paper, bronze scale models, and silver drawing compasses. On the marble mantelpiece rested a small brass optical prism that caught the low ambient lamplight, scattering faint warm rainbows across the plaster ceiling. Clara returned, carrying a plush white cotton towel. She didn't hand it to Maya. Instead, she stepped directly into Maya's personal space, stopping so close that the hem of her dark trousers brushed against Maya's legs. Clara raised her hands, gently draping the soft towel over Maya's damp, dark hair. Methodically, she began drying Maya's hair, her fingers massaging Maya's scalp through the fabric with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Maya stood completely still, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched Clara's face, the intense focus in her eyes, the slight parting of her lips, the sheer heat radiating off her body in the quiet room. "You're staring," Clara whispered, her hands slowing down, her thumbs coming to rest gently against the warm skin of Maya's temples. "You're standing too close," Maya replied, her voice dropping into a low, husky register that vibrated in the small room. "Am I?" Clara leaned in half an inch further, her chest practically flush against Maya's. Through the thin silk of her charcoal top, Maya could feel the quick, rising rhythm of Clara's breathing. "You didn't step back." "I don't retreat," Maya said, her hand rising instinctively to rest against Clara's waist. She felt the lean, smooth curve of Clara's side through the silk, her thumb pressing lightly into the warm small of her back. Clara let out a low, shuddering breath. Her fingers slipped down from the towel, tracing the sharp angle of Maya's jawline, her thumb softly sweeping over the full swell of Maya's lower lip. The physical charge in the room felt so thick it was almost suffocating, a wire pulled so taut it threatened to snap with the slightest movement. "We won the approval, Maya," Clara whispered, her hazel eyes darkening, searching every inch of Maya's face with fierce, undisguised longing. "The project is ours." "Is that all this is about?" Maya asked, her grip on Clara's waist tightening, pulling her a fraction of an inch closer until there was zero air left between them. "The project?" Clara looked down at Maya's lips, her breathing shallow and uneven. The cool, impenetrable mask she always wore at the work sites was completely gone, replaced by something raw, hungry, and entirely vulnerable. "You know it isn't," Clara murmured, her voice barely audible over the sound of the autumn rain lashing against the high glass windows outside. Slowly, deliberately, Clara tilted her head, her breath grazing Maya's lips, pausing just a single millimeter away from the edge of a kiss, demanding Maya to close the final, impossible distance. Maya closed the final millimeter. When her lips met Clara's, the lingering static that had built between them over blueprint edges, rain-slicked streets, and silent challenges finally shattered. The kiss was deep, slow, and consuming, an unraveling of carefully maintained defenses that felt less like a surrender and more like a long-overdue collision. Clara let out a small, soft intake of breath against Maya's mouth. Her long fingers immediately tangled into the damp dark waves at the back of Maya's head, pulling her closer until there was no remaining space, no ambient chill, no professional distance left in the quiet apartment. Maya's hands tightened against Clara's waist, dragging her firm, lithe body flush against her own. Clara tasted like cool rainfall and bitter dark tea, warm and entirely intoxicating. The restraint that had governed every sharp remark and deliberate glance since they met in the Williamsburg coffee bar burned away into pure, unfiltered physical electricity. When Maya shifted her lips along Clara's jawline, brushing soft kisses against the sensitive skin beneath her ear, Clara's grip on Maya's shirt tightened. Her breath caught, her head tilting back slightly as a quiet, helpless sigh escaped her lips. "Maya," Clara whispered, her voice rough, velvet soft, and completely stripped of its usual mocking composure. Maya brought her lips back to Clara's, kissing her with an intense, quiet devotion that made Clara's knees weaken. Clara leaned heavily into Maya's hold, her palms sliding up over Maya's shoulders, tracing the strong contours of her neck, her thumbs gently caressing the warm, flushed skin of Maya's cheeks. They moved together through the low amber light of the living room toward the deep leather sofa near the marble fireplace. Neither spoke. The only sound in the high-ceilinged room was the steady, heavy cadence of the storm outside and the quiet, uneven rhythm of their breathing. When they sank onto the cushions, Clara remained in Maya's lap, her legs wrapped around Maya's waist. Clara looked down at her, her dark hazel eyes wide, dark, and filled with a luminous vulnerability that Maya had never seen before. The cool, impenetrable lighting director from London had vanished, leaving only a woman whose heart was hammering against her ribs at the exact same racing speed as Maya's. "You're lethal, Vance," Clara murmured, her hand gently tracing the bridge of Maya's nose down to the curve of her lower lip, her thumb lingering on the damp skin. "You set the trap," Maya replied softly, catching Clara's wrist and pressing a slow kiss against her inner palm, right over the steady, heavy pulse. "I just walked into it." "No," Clara murmured, leaning down to press her forehead against Maya's, their breaths mingling in the quiet space. "You didn't walk in. You took the lead." They stayed like that for hours as the storm gradually spent its strength against the tall glass panes. Wrapped in a heavy wool throw blanket, sitting side by side on the sofa with their legs intertwined, the silence between them transformed from an arena of sharp competition into a sanctuary of quiet, effortless intimacy. Clara rested her head against Maya's shoulder, her long fingers loosely laced with Maya's. For the first time, Clara talked about her 3 years in London, the cold, pristine studios, the distant clients, and the overwhelming isolation of succeeding in a city where no one ever challenged her vision. Maya listened, her chin resting atop Clara's dark, soft hair, her thumb gently caressing Clara's knuckles. "And then I saw your drawings," Clara said softly, her eyes staring into the low glow of the floor lamp. "I saw someone who built with bone and spine, not just glass and steel. I knew I had to come back." Maya turned her face, pressing a tender kiss into Clara's temple. "I'm glad you came back." Clara smiled, a quiet, breathtaking smile that reached all the way to her eyes. She turned in Maya's arms, sliding her hand behind Maya's neck to pull her down into another soft, lingering kiss that tasted of quiet promises and lingering warmth. The morning sun broke over Brooklyn Heights with a clean, brilliant clarity. Blue sky stretched wide over the East River, and the air smelled of wet oak leaves and ocean salt. Maya woke to the low, humming vibration of an espresso machine. She sat up on the sofa, the wool blanket pulling around her waist. She wore one of Clara's oversized charcoal cotton shirts, the sleeves rolled twice past her wrists. Through the open archway leading into the kitchen, Clara stood by the marble counter in a pair of high-waisted linen trousers and a soft white tank top, her dark hair pinned up loosely with a silver clip. Clara turned, holding 2 white porcelain cups. Seeing Maya awake, her hazel eyes softened instantly with an easy, unhurried warmth. "Double ristretto," Clara said, stepping into the living room and offering one of the cups to Maya. "No oat milk, but I managed a dash of cinnamon." Maya took the warm cup, her fingers deliberately brushing Clara's as she did. "Learning my preferences already, Mercer." "I'm an observant lighting director," Clara replied smoothly, taking a seat beside Maya on the sofa, resting her bare feet on the edge of the coffee table. She leaned in, pressing a brief, sweet kiss to the corner of Maya's mouth before taking a sip of her own coffee. "I pay attention to critical details." "So," Maya said, her thumb tracing the rim of her porcelain cup, her eyes locking onto Clara's with a mixture of warmth and subtle curiosity. "What happens when we step back onto the domino site in 2 hours?" Clara looked at her over the rim of her cup, her expression turning thoughtfully serene. "We do our jobs, Maya. We build something extraordinary. And us." Clara reached out, her cool fingers sliding under the collar of Maya's borrowed shirt, lightly resting against her collarbone. "There is no us that gets hidden behind blueprints anymore, Vance. But in front of Marcus and the crew, we keep our edge." A small, dangerous glint returned to Clara's eyes. "I still intend to question every one of your fixture placements." Maya laughed, a bright, clear sound that filled the sunlit room. She set her cup down on the table, reached out, and pulled Clara into her lap by her waist, ignoring Clara's quiet gasp of surprise. "Question them all you want," Maya murmured, leaning in until their lips were brushes away. "I'll just prove you wrong every time." "Is that a promise, architect?" Clara whispered, her hands finding Maya's waist. "It's a structural guarantee." By 10 in the morning, the raw brick interior of the Domino Sugar Factory was bustling with activity. Construction managers in yellow hard hats walked the perimeter, steel fabricators were measuring the secondary ceiling joists, and Marcus stood near the center table, looking through a set of electrical permits with a wide, triumphant grin. When Maya and Clara walked through the massive iron gates together, side by side, the atmosphere was strictly professional. Maya wore her structured charcoal blazer, her portfolio case in hand. Clara wore her dark tailored coat, her posture flawless and authoritative. There they are, the dynamic duo, Marcus called out, clapping his hands together as they approached. The preservation board couldn't stop raving about the floating brass channel concept in their morning press brief. You two pulled off a miracle. It wasn't a miracle, Marcus, Clara said smoothly, taking her place beside the long plywood work table. Her tone was precise, professional, and composed. It was simply superior spatial math. An exceptional lighting integration, Maya added, unrolling a clean master blueprint across the dusty table. As Maya leaned over the drawing to mark the primary electrical junction box, Clara stepped in right beside her. To Marcus and the hard-hatted foreman standing nearby, they appeared completely focused on the task at hand, two top-tier professionals collaborating on an ambitious historic restoration. But beneath the table, out of sight of the crew, Clara's hand slipped into Maya's. Her fingers wrapped firmly around Maya's, her thumb rubbing a slow, tender circle against Maya's palm as Maya continued speaking to Marcus without missing a single beat. We'll begin the brass conduit installation on the south wall first, Maya said, her voice rich, steady, and filled with quiet authority, her hand subtly squeezing Clara's in return. That way, we catch the afternoon light exactly where we need it. Clara turned her head, her hazel eyes meeting Maya's profile. A subtle, private smile touched her dark lips, a silent, shared secret that belonged entirely to them, held safe within the rising steel and ancient brick of the city they were building together. 2 weeks into construction, the air inside the Domino Sugar warehouse tasted like powdered mortar, ozone, and crushed river brick. Heavy industrial fans hummed loudly along the high-arched openings, trying to clear the fine white mist hanging over the main hall, where a 3-story steel scaffolding tower reached toward the soaring timber ceiling. Maya stood at the base of the tower, her hard hat tucked under one arm, her sleeves pushed up to her elbows. Her dark hair was tied back in a swift knot, her posture rigid with suppressed fury. In front of her stood Ron, the site's veteran general contractor, a thick-set man in a mud-splattered high-visibility vest who held a grease-stained tablet like a shield. It's a simple call, Vance, Ron grunted, pointing a stubby finger toward the upper truss assembly. The custom floating gusset plates Clara spec'd for the central lightwell atrium are 4 weeks out from the fabricator in Pennsylvania. If we wait for those custom-milled brass sleeves, the glass installation stalls. If the glass stalls, the drywall crews walk on Tuesday. We aren't using off-the-shelf galvanized steel brackets, Ron, Maya said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register that carried easily over the clatter of power tools in the background. The entire structural tension of the atrium rests on those floating sleeves. You put rigid steel plates in there, and the moment the river wind hits 30 knots, the glass flexes against a rigid joint and cracks across 4,000 square feet. It's half the price and keeps us on schedule, Ron argued, crossing his heavy arms. Marcus wants the structural shell closed before the November rain hits. I'm taking it up with him at noon. You don't need to take it up with Marcus, a cool, cut glass voice echoed from the steel staircase above. Maya looked up. Clara was descending the open metal steps from the second-tier catwalk, holding a laser measure in one gloved hand. She wore a tailored black turtleneck under a fitted canvas field jacket, her hard hat resting lightly over her dark, effortless waves. Even covered in a light dust of drywall particles, she moved with an intimidating, absolute grace. Clara stepped onto the concrete floor, her heels clicking against the exposed aggregate slab until she stood directly beside Maya. She didn't look at Ron first, her hazel eyes flicked to Maya, offering a microsecond flare of warmth and solidarity before settling on the contractor with cold precision. "If you install galvanized rigid brackets, Ron," Clara said, her voice smooth as silk and hard as titanium, "the light transmission efficiency drops by 14%. The shadow profile along the southern axis will look like an industrial train depot instead of a high-end commercial loft." "Miss Mercer, with all due respect, it's a lighting fixture." "It is not a lighting fixture," Clara interrupted softly, stepping half an inch closer to Ron. "It is the structural spine of the daylight strategy. I spent 48 hours recalibrating the LED driver channels specifically to interact with the reflective brass coating on those milled sleeves. You replace them with dull galvanized steel, and my lighting grid looks flat, cheap, and wrong." Ron looked between the two women, Maya, standing her ground with fierce, analytical resolve, Clara, delivering a lethal technical takedown with soft-spoken perfection. "You two are impossible," Ron muttered, letting his arms drop in defeat. "What do you suggest we do about the 4-week delay?" "The fabricator in Pennsylvania isn't the only one with a 4-axis CNC mill," Maya said, pulling a folded sheet of fresh technical specs from her back pocket and thrusting it into Ron's hands. "I spoke to a precision machine shop in Red Hook at 6 this morning. They have the marine-grade brass stock in-house. They can turn out 12 sleeves by Friday afternoon if you send the subcontract deposit today." Ron stared at the CAD drawing, looking up at Maya, incredulous. "You sourced a local fabricator before breakfast?" "I don't like my vision compromised, Ron," Maya replied, her lips curving into a sharp, confident smile. "And Miss Mercer doesn't like cheap light. Send the deposit." Ron shook his head, a reluctant grunt of respect escaping his throat as he turned back toward his site trailer. "Unbelievable. 2 weeks on site and you two already run this place like a military battalion." Once Ron was out of earshot, the heavy noise of the construction crew receded into the background. Maya let out a soft breath, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction. She turned to Clara. "Red Hook Machine Shop. I told you I'd handle the supply bottleneck." Clara stepped closer, stopping well within the personal boundary line that they maintained in front of the subcontractors. She raised one hand, her gloved thumb reaching out to lightly brush a streak of gray drywall dust off Maya's cheek. The touch was quick and professional to an outside observer, but the sudden flare of heat in Clara's eyes sent a jolt straight to Maya's core. "Impressive logistics, Vance," Clara murmured, her voice dropping into that low, private register that belonged only to them. "Although you missed a detail on the silicone gasket tolerance." Maya raised an eyebrow, stepping into Clara's space until the toes of her boots nearly touched Clara's. "Did I now?" "Come up to the upper catwalk," Clara whispered, her hazel eyes gleaming with a quiet, dangerous invitation. "I'll show you where your math slants." 10 minutes later, the site fell quiet as the workers filed out for their late afternoon break. 50 feet up, the upper catwalk ran along the top of the building's riverfront facade. Out here, high above the dust and noise, the massive iron-framed industrial windows were open to the October breeze. The sun was beginning its descent over Manhattan, flooding the steel trusses with long, thick rays of crimson, orange, and deep liquid gold. Maya leaned against the heavy iron safety railing, her hands gripping the cold metal as she looked out over the sweeping expanse of the East River. Below, a barge cut through the dark water, leaving a wide trail of white foam that reflected the glowing sky. Clara moved up beside her on the steel mesh floor, resting her forearms on the railing. Her coat was unbuttoned, the cold river breeze lifting dark strands of her hair across her face. "It's breathtaking up here," Clara said quietly, her eyes fixed on the distant outline of the Manhattan Bridge. "It is," Maya agreed softly. She didn't look at the river. She looked at Clara, the way the twilight caught the sharp, elegant contour of her profile, the way the golden light danced across her skin, the calm, quiet strength that emanated from her every movement. Clara turned her head, catching Maya staring. A slow, breathtaking curve touched her lips. "You're doing it again." "Doing what?" "Looking at me instead of the architecture." "You are the architecture, Mercer," Maya said, her voice dropping into an unhurried, velvety roughness. She turned her body, trapping Clara between her arms as her hands gripped the railing on either side of Clara's waist. "You're the hardest structural element in this entire building." Clara's breath hitched slightly at the sudden physical proximity. She didn't pull back. Instead, she rested her palms flat against Maya's chest, feeling the heavy, steady thrum of Maya's heart beneath her cotton shirt. "I have to be hard," Clara whispered, her fingers curling slightly into the fabric of Maya's shirt, pulling her a fraction of an inch closer until their jackets brushed. In a world full of bad design and cheap shortcuts, someone has to protect what's real. "And what's real here?" Maya murmured, leaning down until her breath grazed the sensitive skin right beneath Clara's jawline. Clara let out a low, shuddering breath, her eyelids fluttering closed for a fleeting second as Maya's lips brushed soft, electric heat against her neck. The cool autumn wind whipped around them high up on the catwalk, but where their bodies aligned, the heat was suffocating, magnetic, and completely unyielding. "This," Clara whispered, her hands sliding up to wrap around Maya's neck, her long fingers tangling into Maya's dark waves. "You. Me. This precise angle of light before the sun drops." Maya lifted her head, her dark eyes searching Clara's hazel ones with a fierce, unwavering intensity. "No more games, Clara. No more test cases." "No more games," Clara agreed softly, her voice filled with a rare, absolute sincerity that made Maya's heart ache with affection. Clara tilted her chin up, closing the final inch between them. Her lips met Maya's in a deep, slow, possessive kiss that tasted of wind, river salt, and pure, unfiltered longing. High above the bustling floor of the historic sugar factory, framed by the burning Manhattan skyline and the rising iron frame they were bringing back to life, Maya wrapped her arms tightly around Clara's waist, pulling her flush against her chest as the twilight turned the city below into an endless sea of glittering, golden light. The heavy, restored iron gates of the Domino Sugar Factory stood wide open under a dark, clear November sky. Inside the vast, restored brick hall, warm amber light spilled through the exposed yellow pine timber beams, bouncing off the hand-polished brass tracks embedded along the primary structural axes. The central light-well atrium, anchored by the precision-milled floating brass sleeves from Red Hook, radiated a soft, luminous glow that made the heavy glass roof seem to float effortlessly into the dark night above. It was the grand unveiling gala. The 4,000-square-foot space hummed with over 200 guests, New York's premier real estate investors, world-renowned architectural critics, city preservationists, and prominent journalists holding crystal glasses of vintage champagne as flashbulbs flickered across the restored brickwork. Maya stood near the western archway, her back resting against the cold historic masonry that had consumed her every waking hour for the past 6 months. She wore a floor-length emerald silk dress with a clean, low-cut back that accentuated the sharp, athletic lines of her spine. Her dark hair fell in polished waves over one shoulder. She held a crystal flute, her dark eyes scanning the crowded hall with a mixture of quiet pride, professional fulfillment, and restless anticipation. Her mind briefly flashed back to that stormy Thursday night at the Iron Kettle in Williamsburg, to a cold brew espresso cup taken by mistake, a sharp graphite line drawn on translucent vellum paper, and an arrogant, magnetic stranger in a wet wool coat who had challenged her entire approach to daylight design. "It's an absolute triumph, Vance," Marcus said, stepping up beside her in a tailored velvet tuxedo, a glass of aged bourbon held comfortably in his hand. "The senior editor from Architectural Digest just told me the lighting integration is the finest example of historic adaptive reuse in Brooklyn this decade. The credit belongs equally to the lighting scope, Marcus," Maya said smoothly, her voice calm, composed, and resonant. "Without the indirect LED grid, the yellow pine would look heavy and dark." She made the spatial volume breathe. "Speaking of Miss Mercer," Marcus chuckled warmly, gesturing with his glass toward the center of the main floor. "She's currently holding court with the chair of the Landmarks Preservation Commission and 2 prospective commercial clients from London." Maya followed his gaze across the crowded room. Clara stood directly beneath the soaring Lightwell atrium, illuminated by the very lighting architecture she had painstakingly engineered. She wore a striking ivory silk tuxedo suit with a deep plunge neckline, sharp tailored lapels, and minimalist silver jewelry. Her dark waves were swept back, her posture regal, effortless, and undeniably magnetic. As if sensing Maya's gaze from across the bustling floor, Clara shifted her position mid-sentence. Her hazel eyes cut straight through the crowded room, locking onto Maya with an intense, unwavering focus. A faint, knowing smile touched the corner of Clara's dark lips, a silent, private signal that sent a sharp pulse of pure warmth straight through Maya's veins. "If you'll excuse me for a moment, Marcus," Maya murmured, setting her untouched champagne flute on a passing server's silver tray. "I need to double-check the secondary lighting dimmers on the mezzanine level before the speeches begin." "Of course," Marcus smiled, completely oblivious to the quiet physical current passing between his 2 lead designers. "Take your time, Maya. Enjoy your victory tonight." Maya slipped away from the bustling main floor, heading toward the private steel staircase tucked into the shadow of the northern wall. The industrial steps led to the suspended glass mezzanine, a private architectural balcony 60 feet above the concrete slab, designed specifically for mechanical maintenance and private structural viewings. As Maya reached the top of the glass platform, the roar of the party below softened into a rhythmic, distant hum. The air up here was crisp and cool, filled with the faint, comforting scent of cured yellow pine, cold river air, and hand-polished metal. Out through the floor-to-ceiling glass, the East River stretched like a dark ribbon, reflecting the shimmering city lights of the Manhattan skyline. A moment later, the heavy iron door of the access staircase clicked shut behind her. Clara stepped onto the transparent glass floor, her ivory silk suit catching the low ambient glow from the ceiling fixtures. Her heels made soft, deliberate taps against the glass surface as she walked toward Maya. She didn't stay near the entrance. She moved with unhurried grace until she stood directly in front of Maya, her dark eyes burning with a fierce, undisguised emotion that had been held under strict professional control all evening. "You're hiding from your admirers, architect," Clara whispered, stopping barely 3 inches away. The lingering fragrance of sandalwood, rain, and cold bergamot drifted off her skin, enveloping Maya completely. "I was waiting for mine," Maya replied softly, refusing to back away an inch as her eyes tracked the subtle, elegant curve of Clara's neck above the open lapels of her ivory suit. Clara reached out, her long, manicured fingers lightly grasping the delicate silk strap resting on Maya's shoulder. Her touch was gentle, but her grip carried a firm, possessive strength, her thumb brushing against the warm skin of Maya's collarbone. "Look down," Clara murmured, her voice dropping into a rich, velvet pitch that echoed softly against the glass walls. Maya turned her head, looking out over the glass safety railing. Below them, the grand warehouse was bathed in the flawless, warm spectrum of their joint creation. The concealed brass tracks reflected indirect light across the historic red brickwork, creating an atmosphere that felt both ancient and impossibly modern. The guests below moved like small figures within a cathedral of warm, golden light. "We actually did it," Maya whispered, her breath catching slightly in her throat as she took in the full scope of their work. "You built the frame, Vance," Clara said, stepping flush against Maya's side, her body radiating an intense, comforting heat in the cool air of the mezzanine. She reached out, her hand sliding down Maya's arm until her fingers interlaced tightly with Maya's over the cold metal railing. "I simply showed the city where to look." Maya turned in Clara's hold, her hand rising instinctively to rest against the soft, warm curve of Clara's jawline. She felt the smooth texture of Clara's skin, the slight pulse beating rapidly under her fingertips. "You changed everything, Clara," Maya said, her dark eyes searching Clara's hazel ones with a quiet, fierce sincerity. "Not just this building. Me." Clara's expression softened, the sharp, defensive barriers she had carried across oceans and through years of professional battles melting away entirely. She leaned into Maya's hand, her cheek resting against Maya's palm as she let out a slow, trembling breath. "I spent 3 years in London designing light for empty, lifeless spaces, Maya," Clara whispered, her thumb caressing Maya's inner wrist, right over her racing pulse. "I thought perfection was about total control. About absolute symmetry. But when I walked into the Iron Kettle and saw your drawings, I realized I didn't want sterile control anymore. I wanted friction. I wanted someone who could challenge me, push me, and match me stride for stride." "And did you find her?" Maya murmured, her lips brushing against the corner of Clara's mouth, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. "I found my match," Clara whispered against Maya's lips. Clara closed the remaining distance, bringing her dark mouth down on Maya's in a deep, slow, possessive kiss that tasted of sweet champagne, cool autumn wind, and absolute devotion. Maya wrapped her arm tightly around Clara's waist, pulling her lithe, elegant body flush against her own, feeling the steady, heavy rhythm of Clara's heart beating in perfect sync with hers. There were no technical calculations left to prove, no municipal preservation boards to satisfy, and no stubborn site contractors to battle. Up on the floating mezzanine, high above the bustling city they had chosen together, they stood in the radiant warmth of the light they had built with their own hands and shared vision. When Clara finally pulled back a fraction of an inch, her breathing shallow and her eyes gleaming with quiet triumph in the golden amber light, she rested her forehead gently against Maya's. "What's our next project, Vance?" Clara asked softly, a small, breathtaking smile curving her lips. Maya laughed gently, her fingers tightening around Clara's hand as her gaze drifted out through the high industrial windows toward the wide, glittering expanse of the East River and the sprawling, luminous Manhattan skyline beyond. "Whatever it is, Miss Mercer," Maya replied, her voice rich, steady, and filled with infinite confidence, "we build it together." Clara leaned in and kissed her once more, a quiet, unbreakable promise held beneath the soaring trusses of Williamsburg, where ancient brick met floating light, and where two fierce, independent visions had finally found their permanent home. 3 weeks after the gala, the autumn air over Red Hook was sharp and brackish, smelling of tidal salt, diesel smoke, and roasted coffee beans drifting from the roastery on Van Brunt Street. Maya stood in the center of a 500-square-foot timber and brick loft on the second floor of a converted 19th-century shipping warehouse. The ceiling was 12 feet high, supported by weathered pitch pine columns that had held up cotton bales and rum barrels 100 years ago. Through 3 massive arched windows facing west, the glinting expanse of upper New York Bay stretched toward the Statue of Liberty, catching the pale, brilliant late afternoon sun. The floor was raw white plank oak, scarred with iron shoe marks, heavy grease stains, and historical wear. The open space was completely empty, save for 2 folding wooden chairs, a heavy brass tape measure, and a thermal flask of fresh black coffee from the corner bakery. A key turned in the heavy brass lock of the entrance door. Clara stepped inside, letting the thick timber door click shut behind her. She wore a long charcoal wool coat over a cream cable knit sweater, her dark hair tossed by the river breeze, her cheeks faintly flushed from the walk up from the bus stop. She carried a leather binder under her arm and a small paper bag smelling of warm cinnamon pastries. The brickwork along the eastern wall has a 3-degree structural bow, Clara said without greeting, her hazel eyes immediately scanning the perimeter with her characteristic, razor-sharp accuracy. She set the binder on one of the folding chairs. If you put your main drafting station there, Vance, your morning direct sunlight will hit the screen at a brutal 45-degree glare. Maya turned around, a slow, fond smile spreading across her lips. She walked across the wide oak planks toward Clara, her boots making solid, grounding thuds against the wood. "Good afternoon to you too, Mercer," Maya said softly. She stopped right in front of Clara, reaching out to slide her hands into the warm pockets of Clara's charcoal coat, gently pulling Clara forward until their coats brushed. "I see you're already redecorating." Clara looked down at Maya's hands in her pockets, then up into Maya's dark, laughing eyes. Her cool professional reserve dissolved instantly, replaced by that soft, radiant warmth reserved only for Maya. "I'm preventing spatial errors," Clara murmured, her long fingers coming up to rest lightly against the sides of Maya's neck. Her thumbs caressed Maya's jawline, her touch warm and possessive. Someone has to protect the lead architect from her own lighting oversights. "Is that why you signed the master lease application this morning?" Maya asked, her voice dropping into a low, playful pitch. "Just to save me from glare." Clara paused, her hazel eyes searching Maya's face with quiet, unyielding intensity. "I signed the master lease because I couldn't imagine looking at blueprints or building spaces with anyone else in this city." Maya felt a familiar, deep thrum in her chest. She stepped half an inch closer, trapping Clara against the heavy wooden door frame behind her. She reached up, catching Clara's lower lip between her thumb and forefinger, softly tracing the smooth curve. "Say it again," Maya whispered. Clara's lips twitched into a subtle, teasing curve. "I signed the lease, Vance." "The other part?" Clara let out a low, breathless laugh, her hands sliding under Maya's coat to wrap around her waist, pulling Maya completely flush against her. "I'm turning down the London director position." Maya's movement stilled. Her dark eyes locked onto Clara's. "What?" "The firm in Mayfair called yesterday morning," Clara murmured, her gaze steady, unblinking, and entirely sincere. "They doubled their original offer. They wanted me back in the London office by January." "And you declined?" Maya asked, her voice dropping into a quiet, stunned whisper. "I told them my primary practice is now based in Brooklyn," Clara said, her fingers tightening around Maya's waist, her tone filled with an absolute, unshakable certainty. "I told them I've partnered with an architect who refuses to compromise on quality, and that I have zero interest in working 6,000 miles away from my heart." Maya stood frozen for a long beat, the weight of Clara's choice sinking deep into her soul. London had been Clara's kingdom, a place of prestige, international influence, and security. And she had traded it for a raw, drafty loft in Red Hook with exposed brick and no heating ductwork installed yet. Maya brought her hand up to the back of Clara's neck, entangling her fingers in Clara's dark waves, and pulled her down into a deep, fierce, consuming kiss. Clara let out a quiet sigh against Maya's mouth, her arms tightening like iron bands around Maya's back. The kiss tasted of bitter coffee, warm cinnamon, and the crisp autumn wind outside. There was no professional posturing left, no competitive edge to maintain, only a profound, grounding release of devotion that made the empty room around them fade into complete insignificance. When Maya finally parted their lips, both of them were breathing fast, their foreheads resting together in the golden light pouring through the west windows. "You're crazy, Mercer," Maya murmured against Clara's lips, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. "I'm calculated," Clara corrected softly, her thumb caressing the soft skin over Maya's cheekbone. "I run thermal variance tests before making major investments. The return on this partnership is exponentially higher." "This partnership?" Maya teased gently, brushing her lips against Clara's jawline down to the sensitive dip of her collarbone, making Clara's breath hitch. "The firm," Clara whispered, her head tilting back slightly as Maya's mouth pressed slow, burning kisses against her neck. "Vance Mercer Studio. Or Mercer Vance. We still have to negotiate the title ordering." Maya chuckled against Clara's skin, her hands sliding down to rest securely on Clara's hips. "Vance Mercer has a better cadence." "We'll run a panel survey," Clara murmured, her hands coming up to cup Maya's face, pulling her back up until their eyes met. "Now show me where you want the primary conference table." They spent the next hour walking the empty perimeter of the loft, mapping out their future with precise, deliberate movements. They used Maya's brass tape measure to mark off 30-foot spans on the floor, arguing passionately over every square inch with the effortless, sharp banter that had defined them from the beginning. Clara wanted an open indirect lead track running along the southern timber joists. Maya insisted on custom blackened steel pendants hovering over the central drafting island. Clara wanted a private lounge area by the western river view. Maya argued that the best sunlight should be shared by the entry reception. By 5 o'clock, the sun began its final descent toward the Jersey skyline across the bay. The light inside the loft shifted from bright yellow to a deep, radiant crimson that painted the raw brick walls in shades of burned copper and dark rose. Clara stood near the center window, holding 2 paper cups of lukewarm coffee she had poured from the thermal flask. Her dark coat was unbuttoned, revealing the soft cream cable knit sweater underneath. The fading autumn sunlight illuminated her sharp profile, turning her hazel eyes into pools of glowing liquid amber. Maya walked up behind her, stepping close until her chest rested against Clara's back. She wrapped her arms around Clara's waist, resting her chin on Clara's shoulder. "Look at that light," Maya whispered, looking out over the water where tugboats cut silent paths through the molten red tide. Clara rested her head back against Maya's shoulder, taking a slow, deep breath of the cold river air leaking through the window seams. She reached down, her long fingers interlacing with Maya's over her waist. "It's 4,000 Kelvin, Clara noted softly, her voice rich with contentment. "Warm, unfiltered, and temporary." "Nothing about this is temporary," Maya said gently, pressing a firm kiss into the curve of Clara's neck. Clara turned slightly in Maya's arms, looking into her eyes. The quiet vulnerability that Clara used to guard so carefully was now completely exposed, warm and steady. "We have 2 months to build out this space before our first commercial contract starts in January," Clara said, her thumb tracing the back of Maya's hand. 2 months is plenty of time," Maya smiled, her gaze dropping to Clara's dark lips. Especially when I have the best lighting director in the city working for me. Working with you, Vance, Clara corrected with a sharp, beautiful flash of her hazel eyes. Working with me, Maya conceded, leaning in to capture Clara's lips once more as the last rays of red light faded from the brick walls, leaving them held in the quiet, warm darkness of the space they were building together. The first snowfall of December arrived in New York with quiet, sudden velocity. By 5 in the afternoon, thick white flakes were swirling sideways across the dark, churning waters of Upper New York Bay, dusting the historic cobblestones of Red Hook in a clean, soft blanket. Inside the second-floor loft on Van Brunt Street, the air smelled of freshly cut cedar, joint compound, and strong espresso from the Italian roastery down the block. A heavy-duty industrial electric heater hummed steadily in the center of the room, casting a warm orange glow across the raw red brick walls and wide oak floorboards. Spread across a temporary plywood drafting table were blue-bound site drawings, material samples of oxidized zinc, and scale foam board models. This was the first major bid submitted directly to Vance Mercer Studio, a 4,000-square-foot contemporary sculpture gallery on West 24th Street in Chelsea, owned by a notoriously exacting private collector and former museum curator named Elena Thorne. Maya leaned over the scale model, a graphite pencil tucked behind her ear, her denim sleeves rolled up to reveal her forearms. Her dark hair was pinned up in a loose, utilitarian knot that kept threatening to come undone as she worked. The gallery layout requires an uninterrupted central corridor, Maya said, her thumb tracing the narrow foam lane representing the primary exhibition hall. Elena's centerpiece is a 6-ton raw basalt sculpture imported from Oregon. If we use standard floor-anchored concrete plinths, we lock the entire gallery into a rigid, inflexible exhibition path. I want cantilevered steel plates anchored directly into the structural brick perimeter instead. Clara stood across the table, wearing a dark navy cashmere turtleneck that accentuated her long, elegant neck, her wool coat draped over a nearby sawhorse. She held a miniature fiber-optic light pen, testing precise beam angles against a tiny cardboard replica of the basalt sculpture. The cantilevered plinths are structurally elegant, Vance, Clara murmured, her hazel eyes focused intently on the intersection of light and shadow along the model's floor slab. But Elena's lighting brief is non-negotiable. 0 direct ultraviolet exposure on the adjacent organic fiber installations. If you anchor the plinths 3 feet off the perimeter wall, my ceiling-mounted microprism track will cast a harsh secondary shadow along the bottom third of the stone. Maya looked up from her sketches, meeting Clara's gaze across the narrow drafting table. The heat from the industrial heater drifted between them, but the intense, competitive spark in Clara's eyes had nothing to do with the room's ambient temperature. Not if we tilt the plinths 4 degrees downward, Maya countered, stepping around the corner of the table until her shoulder brushed lightly against Clara's. We drop the plinth profile, create a floating shadow gap beneath the mounting plate, and let the stone look like it's levitating above the floor slab. Clara tilted her head slowly, her gaze dropping from Maya's eyes to the drawing paper, then back up. A faint, razor-thin smile touched her dark lips. A 4-degree tilt, Clara repeated softly, her voice dropping into a low, hypnotic register that resonated in the quiet loft. You're asking me to bend a continuous lead light beam around a 90-pound block of solid zinc. I'm asking you to do what you do best, Miss Mercer, Maya whispered, shortening the physical distance between them until her chest almost touched Clara's arm. Make the impossible look effortless. Clara set the fiber-optic pen down on the plywood. She didn't look down at the model anymore. Instead, she turned her body fully toward Maya, her long hand reaching out to capture Maya's wrist. Her touch was firm and warm, her fingers resting directly over Maya's steady, racing pulse. "You're using my own design philosophy against me, architect," Clara murmured, her thumb rubbing a slow, lingering circle against the sensitive skin of Maya's inner wrist. "It's not against you," Maya said, her dark eyes softening as her hand turned over in Clara's grip, her fingers interlacing securely with Clara's. "It's with you. That's the entire point of this studio." Clara looked around the drafty, half-finished loft. Outside the massive arched windows, the driving snow was turning the harbor into a blurred world of quiet white and distant, shimmering tugboat lights. Inside, the warm orange glow from the heater washed over their temporary drafting table, casting long, intimate shadows across the bare oak floorboards. Clara let out a low, soft breath, her posture relaxing completely as she pulled Maya half an inch closer into her personal space. "Eleanor Thorne meets us at 9 tomorrow morning at her private Chelsea residence," Clara whispered, her other hand coming up to gently smooth down a stray dark wave of hair behind Maya's ear. Her cold silver ring brushed against the warm skin of Maya's temple. "She's rejected 4 major Manhattan design firms this month alone. She thinks independent young studios lack the technical rigor required for museum-grade conservation." "Let her think whatever she wants," Maya replied, her voice rich with quiet, absolute confidence. "Until she sees our combined daylight simulation model." "The daylight simulation model," Clara noted softly, her lips curving into a slow, breathtaking smile that reached her hazel eyes, "that still lacks its primary ceiling diffuser array." "Then show me how to build it, Mercer," Maya whispered back. Clara didn't answer with words. She picked up a thin strip of frosted acrylic and a silver scalpel from the tool tray. Stepping directly behind Maya, Clara reached around her waist, her long arms framing Maya as they both bent over the miniature gallery model. Clara's front was flush against Maya's back, her soft cashmere sweater radiating a deep, comforting heat through Maya's cotton shirt. The subtle, intoxicating scent of rain, sandalwood, and cold winter air wrapped around Maya, making her breath hitch in her chest. "Hold the frame steady right here," Clara instructed softly, her warm breath brushing the sensitive shell of Maya's ear as her long fingers guided Maya's hands onto the small acrylic strip. Maya held the tiny frame, her heart hammering against her ribs at the intense physical closeness. She could feel every breath Clara took, every subtle shift of her body as Clara leaned in closer, carefully fitting the microprism diffuser into the miniature ceiling channel. "Notice how the light scatters when the angle hits 32 degrees. Clara murmured, her chin resting lightly on Maya's shoulder as she slid the light pen into place, illuminating the miniature space. The visual effect was instantaneous and staggering. The tiny foam gallery was flooded with a soft, perfectly balanced illumination that completely eliminated the harsh secondary shadow along the base of the sculpture, making the mini cantilever appear to float effortlessly in mid-air. Maya stared into the tiny room, a quiet gasp of genuine admiration escaping her lips. "It's completely flawless." "It's precision," Clara corrected gently, her lips brushing soft, electric warmth against the curve of Maya's neck just beneath her jawline. Maya turned her head slowly, her lips grazing Clara's cheek before finding Clara's mouth in a slow, deep, possessive kiss. The scalpel and light pen slipped forgotten onto the plywood work table as Clara turned Maya in her arms, wrapping her long wool coat around Maya to pull her completely flush against her chest. The kiss tasted of dark espresso, cold rain, and warm winter skin. Outside, the December blizzard lashed silently against the high glass panes, but inside the raw Red Hook loft, the heat between them burned away every trace of the winter chill. Maya's hands slid beneath Clara's coat, her fingers pressing into the soft cashmere of Clara's sweater, anchoring her close. Clara let out a low, shuddering sigh against Maya's lips, her fingers tangling into Maya's hair, holding her with a fierce, uncompromising devotion that went far deeper than any professional alliance. When they finally broke apart minutes later, their breathing was shallow and uneven in the quiet, heater-warmed space. Clara looked into Maya's dark eyes, her hazel pupils wide and luminous in the low orange light. She raised her thumb, gently wiping a tiny smear of graphite from the corner of Maya's jawline before carefully packing the miniature model into its protective transport case. "We win the Chelsea contract tomorrow," Clara said quietly, her tone leaving zero room for doubt as she closed the case latch with a solid, decisive click. Maya smiled, reaching out to lace her fingers tightly with Clara's, drawing her close for one final, lingering kiss before they turned off the industrial heater, wrapped their coats tightly around their shoulders, and locked the heavy timber door of their studio behind them. Outside on Van Brunt Street, the world was blanketed in a serene, muffling silence. White snow accumulated on the roofs of parked cars and rusted iron railings, catching the warm yellow glow of the street lamps overhead. Clara slipped her gloved hand into Maya's coat pocket, her fingers finding Maya's warm hand and holding tight as they walked side by side toward the corner bistro, their boots crunching softly in the fresh winter snow.